Good evening, everyone. Good to see you here. Hopefully you're having a good week this far. Hopefully I won't change it from me to good week. That's my plan anyway. So we have a few people on our announcements list for this evening. Scott Ely is leaving this evening for a mission trip to Luzon, Philippines. Please pray for his safety, success in teaching, and in serving in different congregations and campus ministries while he is there. Judy Hayes' cataract surgery went well today. Doug Reed was scheduled to come home today. Don't know that he did or didn't, but he's still not accepting visitors at this time. Bob Erickson should have finished his radiation treatments today. He will be on medication until 2027, so he's got a while to go on medication to get to that point. But we're happy, hopefully the radiation has served its purpose from them. Diane Whitner will have a stent put in her eye for glaucoma tomorrow. So that's the one we have that's in the future. So other people that we should be mindful of, or other situations we should be mindful of as we pray not only tonight, but also as the week goes on. All right, bow with me then. Dear Heavenly Father, we are again grateful for this opportunity to get together with fellow Christians, to study your word, to learn more about you and more about what you expect from us and what others have laid an example down for us. We ask you be with us throughout this study, that we will gain much from it, we will contribute where we can. We ask you to be with those that are not able to be with us here, not be able to be where they want to be. We mentioned a few that have particular illnesses or issues with their bodies. We ask you be with them and those taking care of them, that those will be alleviated, that they will return to their full health, and wherever possible, return to being in edification with us. We ask you to be with Scott as he prepares to travel tonight all the way to the Philippines, that you'll bless the work that he's going to be involved with over there, that it will bring your kingdom forward, that will encourage fellow Christians over there and find some level of outreach to those that are lost. We ask that you be with the many others that we may be mindful of, that are on our prayer list or our hearts, and those that we're not mindful of that need you in some way, whether it's a physical problem, whether it's a spiritual or emotional problem. We ask that you strengthen them, comfort them, and bring them back to full health in that area. And we ask always for your guidance. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So, exciting things, at least for my pit crew. The clicker's back. No names. We don't know where it came from, but if we figure that, no, we're not going to try to figure that out. We're just going to be happy from that. So the AV pit crew doesn't have to do anything for me today, at least hopefully. So let's summarize what we covered last week. We went over the last of what were identified explicitly as being visions that Isaiah had in the book of Isaiah in chapter 21. Fourth vision, Babylon is viewed as invincible. That's where we started actually 2 weeks ago. That Babylon had gotten to be this kingdom. And we'll see that same kind of thing as we start to look at the visions that Daniel has, where really the people at that time, it was such a glorious kingdom, and its capital is still one of the 7 wonders of the world in some of the lists that people do, even though it was knocked down pretty much completely. But it was seen such a glorious thing that even though you didn't like it, you expect it to keep going on forever. And of course, the fourth vision is not going to say that. In fact, it says there are 2 nations from the east, which we know to be the Medes and the Persians ultimately, will plunder Babylon. They'll conquer Babylon and wipe it out basically from that. And when Isaiah sees this, it basically shakes his foundations of what he believes, because he believes what he has in the world right now. We said you can imagine what it would be if suddenly the U.S. was to be wiped out and conquered from that to the rest of the world. There might be people who think that's great, but it would be a shock to the system because it's kind of just been everything you grew up with. I think for some of us that grew up many years ago, things like that have happened that are just kind of shaking in some ways. What's happened at one point in Russia when the wall fell down to begin with. Maybe it's changed a little again, but that was quite a shake to the system. When China opened its doors from that, it was very weird when I went first to visit China to think about being able to even go there, because when I was a kid, that wasn't going to happen from that. So Isaiah, has a shaking to his system, and it caused him to have some level of pain, some despair, some distress, because he's just not comfortable without shaking out what his world is like now and what will it be in the future. That worries him somewhat. Isaiah then is pictured as a part of the vision and his representation of it as a watchman. He's out there watching for what's going to come And therefore, a watchman is also the one that warns those around. That's why they're set out to be the watchman. And so in that role, he sees chariots coming of various types, and ultimately hears from the people in those chariots that Babylon has fallen. And that's really what shakes him to his core. Like I say, that's just something that he just didn't imagine happening. I can't imagine what that will mean to his world from that. We noted that Isaiah is not the only one that prophesied that. That's also prophesied by Jeremiah, but we don't have it listed as a vision. Like I said before, I think a lot of the prophecies probably were visions. God could have provided them in other ways, but they're just at least not explicitly called out to be a vision, and so therefore we're not visiting Jeremiah's version necessarily as its own separate thing. Any other comments about that one of Isaiah's or any of the others? All right, then we got into Ezekiel, who also, as a prophet, had several of those. His first vision in Ezekiel 1 came in the 5th year of captivity. It was based on Jehoiakim, which was the king of Judah at the time they were taken captive, and he was taken captive and taken to Babylon. Yes, Nebuchadnezzar put somebody else as king, but people, at least the ones in captivity, didn't even recognize who was back there. That wasn't somebody they chose. That wasn't somebody God chose. Yes, he's a part of the family, of the royal family, but the real king was in captivity as far as they were concerned. And so much of Ezekiel is based on the time that Jehoiakim is in captivity, and it bases on that kind of time frame versus other types of time frames. In this vision, he sees a whirlwind of fire, and he sees 4 creatures. And there's all sorts of things to describe the creatures. As we noted later on in the book of Ezekiel, he says later on he realizes that the creatures he's been seeing are cherubim. We see cherubim on top of the ark, for instance. So they're messengers of God. They're winged creatures from that. And that's what he sees up there with the whirlwind of fire. These creatures have, in fact, 4 different faces. We compared it also to things in Revelation where it's different number and different aspects of them. There's a lot of commonality, but still some differences. In this case, you've got a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And later on, we'll see, the man maybe drop out of that and be a leopard instead. But it's all aspects of different characteristics, if you will, in many ways. The lion very much ties to the way that Babylon itself was perceived to be. An eagle would be another one of the other countries from that. But they all had their own characteristics that could apply to it. The creatures in this case had 4 wings. When we see them in Revelation, they have 6. In this case, 2 of them touched other wings, like the cherubim's wings touched each other from over the ark, and then 2 others covered their bodies. So there was the 4 wings that they had from that. He also noted in that vision that the creatures were accompanied by something that was called a wheel. We don't know that it was actually that's what it was. That's just the term he gave for it, the best thing he used to describe it. He even said it was a wheel and a wheel, so that it would allow them to go in any direction that they wanted to, and always it would be going forward, because the 4 faces were there. So there's always a forward for one of those faces from that. And he said basically that the wheel was how they were being led by the Spirit. Their Spirit, or more likely, maybe the Holy Spirit from that. And then also as a part of that dream, there was the firmament above them, and a lot of noise. He related different ways of knowing the noise of the wings and all the noise that he heard from that. From rushing waters to, an army camp, as 2 of the comparisons that he gave from that. And so he very much saw kind of the future from that perspective. His second vision, Ezekiel, chapters 8 through 11, his appearance now, he sees a being with appearance of basically fire. But that does have the appearance of kind of a person. It has something like a hand. That's why it's in quotes there. It said it's not a hand, but the form of a hand. So it looks somewhat like a hand. Maybe it looks a lot like what Daniel saw when the hand, or that Nebuchadnezzar saw when the hand wrote on the wall. We don't know, but that's the one thing it gives there. It gives a kind of a more human appearance, if you will. In this second vision, Ezekiel is taken to Jerusalem. Remember, he's actually in captivity. So he envisions himself, maybe an out-of-body experience, the way sometimes we talk about it here, going back to Jerusalem. And in that, he goes specifically to the temple. And he's got a purpose for being there. And that's because he's going to see that the people that are back there that weren't taken in captivity are just as untrue to God or more untrue to God than those that are in captivity. They're committing abominations there. So the abominations that he viewed, first of all, there was an idol of jealousy that was right by the altar. And because that was there, that was driving God away from his own home, if you will. He couldn't be there. He couldn't abide being there with sin. God can't coexist with sin. That's why he's going to make us perfect to be in his presence from that. And so we don't know exactly what that was. There was different times where the people did put idols into the temple itself, mixed it right in with the worship of Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever you want to put from that. Whether it's one of those times or it's figurative, we don't know. The second one was he was told to dig. There was a hole in the wall which showed that wasn't being well taken care of, and he was told to dig by that hole. And when he does that and goes through it, he sees idols of all abominations, and he sees basically the leaders of the people secretly worshiping these different types of idols, these different types of abominations, whether it is, the animals they might worship or the sun and stars and whatever it would be. He sees that going on. And then he's shown a third one. He's shown women who are weeping basically for the Babylonian god of crops. Because the deal was when you collected all the crops again, obviously the plants all die, then they would weep until the next season when the crops grew up again from that. And that's how they believed that would occur, is because they had to weep for that god in order for it to be fertile again and to get the crops coming from that. So all three of these are worshiping idols of one form or another, but certainly not worshiping God. The last one of the abominations was 25 men. They were in the temple and in the inner court, but they had their backs to the Holy of Holies and everything in there. And instead, they were facing to the east, and they were seen worshiping the sun. And they're doing it, again, right there amongst God's house, right? His abode that he had set apart for him. And all these things were abominations going on, and that he got to have the vision and know that that's what's occurring back in the former promised land that they had been taken out of with the people that are still there. So he was very much aware of the fact that not only was sin occurring and God not being worshipped appropriately where he was in Babylonia, but it was also happening back in the home country from that. However, it didn't end with it all being negative. The end of that vision made a point of saying there's always a remnant. There's a remnant there that are still being true. There's a remnant there that is very saddened by the abominations that are going on, that they're discouraged by that because they want the right things to be happening from that. And so there's a remnant that will remain from that. Any comments about either one of those visions of Ezekiel? All right. Then let's go on to the last one of Ezekiel's visions that's called out. We'll look at chapter 43. In fact, 43, first two verses in this one. He goes, afterward, meaning this is also, he's been going on with some kind of visions and stuff going on before that, but after he brought me to the gate, and the gate that faces towards the east. And behold, the glory of God of Israel came from the way of the east. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. Now we've seen, the voice of the many waters. We talked about that a little bit ago in one of the other visions, where one of the reasons of all the sound was it sounded like rushing of waters. That's what we see here from that. And that was sound coming from, the firmament above and the throne above from that. And we've talked about his glory. And many times he's been in the visions that we've seen, he's been shown in some way or form to be fire or brightness from that. So that gets his glory that's shown onto the earth from that. We see that, we says there that he came from the east. It's interesting in Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 23, God had left the area and he went towards the east. So now he's coming back. So in Ezekiel 11:23 it says, and the glory went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain which is on the east side of the city. And now again, if we go back to verse 2 there, the glory of God came from the way of the east. So he's coming back. So you've got both the departure in Ezekiel and you have the return of God in this particular vision to his people as they sit there from that. Verse 3. It was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when it came to destroy the city. So in this case, he's thinking back to the first vision that we had in the first chapter of Ezekiel. And all that was a part of that. He says the appearance of what I'm seeing here, and I just said that the appearance of God from that, sound of that is much like what he'd experienced before. And so he says the visions were like the vision I saw by the river Chebar. That was the original ones that he had when he first became a prophet, the first chance he got to do that. And the ones before, he was by the river Chebar. And it has a lot of similarities in what we'll see in this particular vision from that. And he fell on his face. He fell down in a worshiping position. He knows this is from God. He wants to recognize this is from God, and so he is very much a person that doesn't necessarily feel worthy of all that. And so he falls down on his face. And the glory of the Lord came into the temple by the way of the gate which faces towards the east. Again, God's returning from the direction that he went from that. We know that God would put his presence into the temple. We've got that reflected in various places, and we know that's how it worked with the cloud of that they were led by in the day, and the fire at night, the pillar of fire at night. But it's going into the temple by that way from the east, where it had departed. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Again, he's in Babylonia. His vision is now taking him. In his experience, he sees himself as being now back in Jerusalem, and now he's in the inner court. And he's in there with God's glory being in there, much like when Moses would go in there, and his presence would be in there. When he was done talking to Moses, would come out with his face shining. Won't happen with Isaiah because it's a vision, not an actual happening like it did to Moses from that. But it certainly harkens back to the situation that we had with Moses from that. Then I heard him speaking to me from the temple. Him, obviously capitalized there, but we know that is God that he said was coming back from the east, so that's who he's talking about from that. And while a man stood next to me. Now, we don't know who the man is. Most likely, most people think, I would think too, there's probably an angel, a messenger from him. We'll see that explicitly called out as a particular person in Daniel's visions, but here we don't. We just have a man. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever. He's saying, I'm back in my temple. This is again my home. We know that when he says, he'll stay there forever, he doesn't necessarily mean forever, ever, ever, right? He means forever until it's not forever, basically, until until, in this case, till the Messiah comes, the law changes, and the covenant is closed, ended in one case, and a new one put into place from that. No more shall the house of Israel defile my holy name. They're not going to be able to do anything to the temple. They're not going to take it to the level that they have in the past of that abominations that we saw his visions of earlier. Not that they will always be true, but they won't go that far again. Nor their kings by their harlotry or with the carcasses of their kings on their high places. And we'll talk about what that means, the carcasses of their kings in high places soon. When they set their threshold by my threshold and their doorpost by my doorpost, with a wall between them and me, they defiled my holy name by the abominations which they committed. Therefore, I have consumed them in my anger. He's talking about a couple things there. One, they've started to build really close to the temple. They didn't leave much room outside of it from that, so they're kind of butting up to it. And it's mostly the king's property that's abutting up against the temple from that. And there's not a whole lot of space there anymore. You haven't set me aside. You haven't separated me like you should have in the past. And then he's also talking about the abominations that, like I say, the previous vision held for what was going on back there. And he says, because of those abominations, I've gone ahead and consumed many of those that were involved with those things in my anger about them. That's the punishment that they got from that. Now, putting away their idolatry and moving the dead kings, and goes on to say, now let them put their harlotry and the carcass of their kings far away from me, and I will dwell in their midst forever. All right? So what would that mean by the dead kings? Well, we find that we always have, where a lot of times we have the kings being put in the Valley of the Kings, put in with the rest of them from that. But in two cases, two of the more evil kings, that didn't happen with them. It started first with Manasseh, which was one of the more evil kings that there was. And 2 Kings 21 verse 18 says, so Manasseh rested with his fathers. That means he passed away. And he was buried, but where was he buried? In the garden of his own house. Remember how we talked about houses started to get really close to God's house? And that's the situation here. In the garden of Uzzah. And then his son Ammon reigned in his place. If we go down to verse 26, Ammon dies. Where's he buried? He was just as evil pretty much as his father Manasseh, and he was buried in his tomb in the Garden of Uzzah. Then Josiah, his son, reigned in his place. So we think that when he talks about the kings and bodies, dead bodies being there, because the palace had gotten really close to the temple itself, and these two very evil kings had been buried right there on the property, that's the reference that's being made there. No guarantees, but it's as good an answer as any. It certainly has some logic to it, because certainly while it's not just two kings that got buried there, it's two very evil kings, very much were in opposition to Jehovah, and so them being buried, what seemed to be almost in proximity to the temple, to God's abode, was very much an abomination to him and very much a challenge, I think, to honoring him from that. And so it makes reasonable sense that that's what they're talking about when they say the king's being buried there. All right, moving on. 10 for 12 of chapter 43 Ezekiel. Now let them put away their harlotry. That is the pursuit of those other gods. That's kind of harlotry. We're not talking about sexual relations per se, but we're saying, trying to have a relationship in any way equivalent with some other god of the people than with the God of Israel from that. And the carcasses of their kings far away from me, the ones we just talked about most likely, and I will dwell in their midst forever. So he says, I've got two conditions. My plan is that I'm going to come there and live, forever. Like we said, it doesn't mean forever ever, but it means forever for a while. But in order for that to happen, two things got to happen. They've got to put away their harlotry. They've got to stop worshiping these other gods, number one, most important probably. And number two, they need to remove the carcasses of their kings. Those two kings that are buried really close, those bodies need to be moved somewhere else, because that's an abomination to be so close to what I see as Holy Land, or my abode, my home from that. And if that happens, then he'll dwell in their midst. Son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern. So he wants them to lay out all the information in there, that it's a very special place. It was defined as to what it was going to be. Now, God didn't define all that. He certainly probably had a role in that. But David had been the one to set the boundaries and describe how things were going to be built and what they were going to look like from that. But he wants them to describe it to the people. He wants them to remember what it was built for, who it was built for, why it was built that way, the separation of the Holy of Holies from the other parts, and the outer court, and all those other things that are involved in it, the other pieces from it, and the pattern that was there, and the stuff. And if he gets that, what is he hoping out of that? And if they are ashamed of all they have done, if they realize that they have violated everything about what was supposed to be here in my temple, and what it was for, the purpose, and who's going to abide there, then make known to them the design of the temple and its arrangement, its exits and its entrances, its entire design and all its ordinances, all its forms and all its laws. Write it down in their sight so that they may keep the whole design and all its ordinance and perform them. This is the law of the temple. The whole area surrounding the mountaintop is most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple. Whenever God wanted to remind people about his law, he normally would say, write it down again. It wasn't that they didn't have it, they had it. But how do you remember better? If I tell you something, or if you write it down for yourself? Now, most of us are going to remember better if we have to actually participate. Just listening to it, we'll catch some of it, but we won't get it as well as if we have to actually think about it and write it down ourselves from that, or see it written down and go through the more arduous process of that as opposed to just listening to it. So he says, make known to them all that stuff and then write it down in their sight. They'll sit there while you're doing that and you talk through that. And they'll be mindful of all the design and all the ordinances and everything there is to it. That's the temple. And then he goes back to the fact that it is the whole mountaintop. It's not just the temple. Going back to why those bodies are a problem, because they're just too close to it. All of that is most holy. It's separated for God. And that is the law of the temple. How it's to be built, how it's to be used, and what all area is going to be involved. Understand that you have violated it. And you need to fix that. You need to go back to doing what you know is right, or at least what you're hearing is right at this point. All right. Any comments before we go to our questions on that vision?
The only thing I see there in verse 12, he starts up at the end of that saying, behold, this is the law of
Yeah. Yeah. He's emphasizing it. He says, behold, that is the law of the temple. This is what you're supposed to have been done. That's supposed to turn the light on from it, that this is something you've got to really take note of and apply, right? Yep. Behold is an important word from that. So we have our normal questions. Whoops. If I leave it on instead of pushing the deal. Who had the vision in this case? Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. What was the situation when it occurred? Well, they're in captivity. They're sinning. He's now well aware of the fact that those that are still back in Israel, the land itself, are sinning and committing sin against God and really creating abominations right there in God's home. The content of that dream or vision is for him to actually have a vision of what's going on there from that. But most of this one, as opposed to some of the others, again goes back to words, right? We don't have it showing being cleaned up or anything else from that. Most of it is, this is what needs to happen. And this is what's been going on. You know it from my other visions from that. So this is, again, mostly an oral vision as opposed to a real visual vision, I suppose. The purpose of the dream and the vision was to, again, call them to action. You need to straighten up. You need to go back to the law of the temple. You need to follow that. You need to get right relationship with me. You need to put away your worship of all these other gods, this idolatry. You need to, recognize the sacredness of the land around my temple and remove the bodies of evil kings from that, take their carcasses away from there. They don't belong here. And so it's a wake-up call from that. And how did it figure into God's general plan? Well, God's plan was that the people of Israel would return to the promised land. And that ultimately would allow for the coming of the Messiah. That needed to happen, but he wanted them to recognize that they had to set some things straight. That wasn't just going to come because God was going to let them do that because the Messiah was going to come. They needed to straighten out their behavior and their relationship with God first. And so that's what needed to happen. And so he's waking them up to trying to get them to do that. Any other comments? All right. We'll turn to our attentions then to Daniel. So there are several, again, in Daniel, and you could argue some more than the ones that are there. Again, we'll stick with the ones where the word vision comes into play, specifically, at least in the New King James, which is what I was using for this particular study. And so the first one up is in Daniel 2. Now, in Daniel 2, we've been there before. So we're not going to go through it in detail and read them all. Why? Because this in Daniel 2 is when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. I have a dream. And he says, okay, in this particular time, as you may recall, he said to all the wise men, hey, I don't just want the interpretation of this. You can make up something, and I know you do. So I'm not going to let you get by with that. This time, what I require is you got to tell me the dream, what it consisted of, and then you can tell me the interpretation. Because if you can't tell me what I dreamed, I can't believe what you're going to say about what it means. And of course, the Chaldeans and all the other wise men said, nobody's ever asked for that. This is an extremely hard thing. Nobody can do that. And Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm not taking any excuses. If you can't do that, I'm going to kill all of you. You're not of any use. If you can't come up with the dream and interpret it, why do I have you? That's what you're supposed to be here for. So clearly, if you fail the task, you're useless. I'll wipe you out. No reason to keep you around. Maybe I'll get some more down the road somehow. And so he begins to try to do some of that from that. But Daniel finds out about the dream, and he, of course, had provided information to him about another dream about, he had given him another situation, but Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we'll give them all their Israelite names. All those that got together, there was these three buddies, they'd all come together into captivity together, came somewhat out of the royal part of the line, some way or another. And Daniel says, hey, we've got to do this. We've got to figure this out or we're all going to be dead. We're all part of the wise men here. So let's all pray to God that he will give us that vision. I've already said that's going to happen. I've got faith that it will. But I want us all to pray to God that he'll give that information to us. And so God provides what was asked, both the dream and the interpretation, to Daniel. And in this case, Scripture said it happened by a vision. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Daniel gets a vision to understand it from that. And as we talked about before with dreams and visions, dreams are commonly done or experienced by non-believers, non-followers. But the visions pretty much exclusively are by those that are truly followers of God from that. So we see the difference between who got the dream and who got the vision there. So that's Daniel's first one in there. So we'll pick up in chapter 7 then with his second vision. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, so we've moved on from Nebuchadnezzar now to Belshazzar, second king under him, and in that time Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. It's impossible to figure out if there's two different parts to this, part of which is a dream and part of it's a vision. Well, they just decided to throw out both words there. Can't tell you why we have both of them in that place, but since we're studying dreams and visions, we get to handle it. Doesn't matter to us. This one would fall into the category either way. So he is in his head. He's lying on his bed, which normally would mean it was probably a dream because it's at night, but we get says visions. And then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. He focused on the main things. He didn't try to write down every detail as he remembered it. He wrote down just the main facts, the highlights of that, kind of an outline of his dream, if you will. And Daniel spoke, saying, I saw my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Now, spoke to whom? We don't know. We don't know who he's speaking to. I think it's mostly just saying this is what he wrote down. And just calling it spoke. He spoke it spoke in existence by writing it down. But anyway, he starts out saying, I see the winds coming from every direction in heaven, and they're stirring up the sea. And now out of the sea we see four great beasts, a very common kind of creature that we see in visions throughout the Old Testament and into Revelation itself from that. And they come up out of the sea. So there it is, evidence of evolution. We got them coming up out of the sea. Okay, maybe not, but as close as you're going to get. The first was like a lion. Now remember, what did Ezekiel see in his beasts? Well, they had four faces, one of which was a lion, right? So it's, in this case, one of the creatures itself is a lion, not just a face. It had eagle's wings, so got wings like we had in the other. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. So it's a lion, it's kind of standing up now, no longer has wings, and it's on just its hind legs, I guess. And a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another, a third beast, like a leopard this time, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So you've so far got 3 of the creatures described, at least in that high level of what Daniel chose to write down, right? We said he only wrote down some of the key things from that. We've got the first one that's like a lion. We said before, the lion very much is indicative and very much represented in a lot of things the kingdom of Babylon. From that, probably is the way it was here. The wings plucked off. We can come up with interpretations. I don't want to spend a lot of time in interpretations. That's not really what the class is fully about. Certainly not to the level we'd go into the prophecies. But it seemed to be somewhat maybe about what would follow the 3 that he had that we're going to follow after the main king Nebuchadnezzar from that. But we don't know whether it's kingdoms, pieces of Babylon, whatever from that. The second beast, like a bear, basically that's kind of gets put into the Persians, which took over from that. Sometimes they're described with that concept, and that they were really a very ravenous people, very bloodthirsty in a lot of ways. Thus you have them with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it's devouring much flesh. They were very much enjoyed killing and wiping people out. That was a pleasure to them from that. And then there was a third, like a leopard, 4 wings of a bird, and 4 heads, and dominion was given over it. Some people think that one would be who came after them. It would be Alexander the Great and the Grecians from that. The Macedonians coming into play. Leopard, very fast. Alexander the Great conquered all of Asia by the time he was 30. He only lived to be 33. So it was very quick that he was able to wipe out people. And he was able to do a lot with very little. He had about 30,000 men, and he defeated Darius as the king of Babylon, who had 600,000. How does that happen? How do you conquer most of the world by the time you're 33 between Asia and Europe? God used him. Has to be the way it worked. But anyway, the leopard, very fast. That's why the wings that get into it from that. Dominion given to it. Obviously, King Alexander the Great had a tremendously huge kingdom at the end of his time. Right or wrong? Don't know. After this, I saw in the night visions, so maybe he calls dreams night visions, I don't know. But you see the word visions coming up again now. And behold, a fourth beast. He separated this one pretty significantly away from it. And he says the fourth beast was dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. Where did we see iron in a previous vision? Remember, we had the body, and that was the legs. And in that case, where do we say probably that represented? The kingdom of whom? Or the empire of what? Or the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire. So, what again, a lot of people think this one means from that. It was dreadful and terrible. It did a lot of just wiping out people from that. It was obviously very strong. It would take over things pretty significantly and make it be its way. It was devouring, breaking pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It pretty much wiped out the countries that were there before, the way they ran their governments, the people that were in charge, wiped those people out. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Now, again, don't know exactly what any of all that means. 10 horns, there were 10, the kingdom of Rome was broken into 10 at one point. That part could be the 3 horns plucked out by the little one coming up that spoke pompous words. Some think that was in Rome, that was the coming up of the papal area, the popes. And there's, again, history to kind of support that, of the Pope being able to kind of have helped to wipe out 3 different countries through parts of that 10 as a part of their history. So who knows, but that's some thought about it. Again, it's not that critical to the situation. And he says, I watched till thrones were put into place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. This is really the only place we have in Scripture where God himself, God the Father, has somewhat of a physical appearance as being a man. This is really the only time that God is pictured in that way. But here we have him. He's seated. That's obviously who the Ancient of Days was. He got that garment white as snow. We all picture him with white hair, right? So that fits the vision that Ezekiel, or Daniel rather, is having here. His throne, that fiery flame, burning fire, wheels, all that stuff reckons back to the time of Ezekiel and his visions as well. So that commonality going through it from that. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Again, that's, fiery deal, his ability to put out, orders and direction and power to make his will be done, to wipe out countries if he wanted to, whatever it might be. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Obviously, I thought maybe that those are angels that are in front of him right there. He's got those. It's kind of like when we talk about Jesus, when he was tempted and stuff, 10,000 angels could have come. God would obviously have more than that. He wouldn't send every one of them in that case. So whether that's it or not, that's the prevailing thought by some at least. The court was seated, people who were before him, and the books were open. Don't know what those books were, but we can assume it might be the book of life or some of those types of things. But we don't have any more information than the books being opened. And I watched then, because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. So even all this is gone. The great judge, Ancient of Days, is up there. That little horn is still blouting and speaking a bunch of gibberish, pompous types of words, and ignoring the fact that the Ancient of Days is already up and at his throne from that. And I watched till the beast was slain. So I'm not just going to wipe out that one horn. It wiped out the fourth beast from that. and its body destroyed and give to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And so all of them are going to come to an end. Ultimately, there's only one true leader, one true king, and that is God himself, the Ancient of Days, as it's put here in this particular deal. So whatever those beasts are, they're not going to continue to go on. They're not going to continue to think that they have dominion. Only one person has ultimate dominion from that. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations, and languages peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Who does that sound like? Jesus, doesn't it? There's the Son of Man coming in, and there it is. And there you've got that already being pictured, the two parts of the three of the Godhead. Right? We don't have to wait for Jesus to be born like that was when he came into existence. You've got the Son of Man coming in this vision already. He's coming to the Ancient of Days, God the Father, and they're both there. And we know Jesus talked about the fact of what God had placed in his hand as he came on this earth from that. And so very much correlates to what we see later. So this is very much of a messianic prophecy in many ways from that. And point is, it's these other ones, they're going to come and go. They may seem really great at the time. They may be very vicious to other kingdoms, but ultimately they are earthly and they have an end. But this final one that's going to come, that's been put into place, the authority given by God himself, the Ancient of Days, it's going to go on, be everlasting, and it's not going to be destroyed. Nothing's going to make it go away. All right? I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body. So he says, my spirit itself. Now, my body is just kind of like the wording here is almost like it's a sheath to a sword, you know. That body doesn't really have grieving capabilities physically. It's your spirit, your mind, those kind of things that you can grieve from that. And the visions of my head troubled me. You know, it's encouraging in some ways to see the coming of the Messiah prophesied here, but there's a whole lot of sadness and a whole lot of carnage going to happen in between where Daniel sits and when that's going to happen. He knows he's not going to see that. That's down the road from that. And so, again, just like they were shaken, like Ezekiel was shaken to understand about Babylon, Daniel's really saddened by what he is getting. He's very troubled by this prophecy, by this visions he's gotten from this. I came near to one of those who stood by, which we think probably are angels, and asked him the truth of all this. So what does this mean, basically? So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So in this case, we're going to get an interpretation. We don't have to assume a lot of things about it. So we can read what theoretically the angel shared with Daniel in this case. Verse 17. Those great beasts, which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. So thus you can see the speculation about which ones those would be that we talked about, from Babylonia to the Roman Empire from that. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. So that's just pretty much a summary of the whole thing. You go on a little bit more, but he's saying, there are four kings that are going to come. They're going to have great impact here on this world, but ultimately the only thing that's going to go on forever is the saints, the holy those following God. They're going to ultimately get the kingdom, and that kingdom is going to go on forever. And that's the sum total of what life is like, right? We're going to go through this, and things are going to happen in this world, but all that really matters is that ultimate kingdom that's going to last forever is that of God and the saints. Then I once wished to know the truth about the fourth beast. See, the fourth beast is pretty troublesome, right? The first three, okay, they're kind of got some interesting characteristics, but they're a little less threatening in some ways than that fourth beast with all those horns, the little horn, and all that stuff that goes on with it. So it's not a surprise. Daniel says, that's kind of interesting. You gave me four beasts, but I want to know about that fourth one. That seems very interesting, and I think I'd like to know more about that one, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze. Now notice, those 2 points that were just made there were not in the original description of the beast. When he originally described the beast, he didn't talk about its teeth being of iron. He mentioned teeth. I think, no, didn't even mention teeth necessarily, but it didn't say of iron, and it didn't mention its nails were made of bronze. So it's interesting that he now has some new details in the description of the beast for whatever reason when he gets defined back. Which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feast. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. And that's really what interests me. That beast is very, very different than the other ones. He's got some very interesting characteristics that you've mentioned to me. You know, the ability he has with the teeth of iron and his nails of bronze, very much built to, destroy. That seems very interesting. And in fact, was described, or I saw it devouring, breaking things to people's, trampling things. So that really makes me wonder about its feet and its, teeth and nails and all that. And then, there was kind of weird. There were 10 horns on this one, as opposed to the other beasts. And then all of a sudden, a little one shows up, and it basically gets rid of 3 of them at that point, and it's interesting because it has eyes. None of the other ones seem to have any eyes. It's got eyes all around, and it's got a mouth, and that mouth doesn't just sit there and, sing or something else nice to it. It's saying very pompous types of words, sharing very pompous things with me. And so this thing seems really, really weird, and it seems more, its appearance is greater. It's more significant than 3 beasts that came before it from that. So what can you tell me about that beast particularly? I got the big picture, that's all nice, but I'd like to know a little bit more about this one specific part of it from that. And I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. Well, that's very discomforting now that it's taking on the saints. At that time, obviously, we're talking about the righteous Jews being the ones that's going on. At least that would be his perception of who those saints were. Probably wasn't really what the vision was about, but that would be his take probably. Until the Ancient of Days came and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So then ultimately God comes, and that's all going to stop. That's going to end. Because the kingdom is really for the saints, and it's not for this beast, anybody that's following that beast from that. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it into pieces. That very much is very descriptive of what Rome did. And he says, then the 10 horns are 10 kings that shall rise from this kingdom. Ultimately, it broke into 10 pieces, the Roman Empire. And another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue 3 kings. As I told you, speculation. Pope, who had a hand in basically wiping out, making no longer exist 3 of those separate kingdoms from that one way or the other. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He's not just speaking pompous words and sounding really very important, but he's speaking them against God himself. He thinks he's more important than God. And so I'm going to give you some information about them from that. He says he'll end up persecuting the saints of the Most High. He's going to persecute the people, right? We don't, we've certainly got that in history. The Roman Empire, and certainly later on the Papal Kingdom did the same kinds of things, trying to persecute other Christians from that. And shall intend to change times and law. Now, that doesn't sound like that one at all, but that's certainly why you can read into it. And then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and times, and half a time. It's going to go on for a while. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion. Now, God doesn't take a court to make a decision, does he? He's like when you go to court and you have it just decided by the judge. There may be other people there, but he ultimately makes the decision from that. The court's there to kind of be the witnesses to it, I suppose. Be the best way to put what the court's role in that is. And they shall take away his kingdom, to consume and destroy it forever. That 4th beast is going away. We've seen that before. His kingdom is going to go away. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms of the whole heaven shall be given to the people. Not any people, but the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. And this is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart.
saying, especially in verse 14, where it says, then to him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, he's talking about Christ, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. And I want to go to Matthew chapter 28.
Okay.
And you can see what it says. Then Jesus came and said to them, to his disciples, saying, all authority has been given unto me, both in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things, whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I be with you always, even to the end of the age. All of that Daniel was talking about when Jesus Christ came into this world, all authority was given to him. And he established his church, and he told his 12 disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. And it fits right in with what he said.
Yeah, absolutely. We see the fulfillment of that as a prophecy, and that's really what Daniel, a lot of it is. There's some history in there, but a lot of it, including the visions, are all prophecies, right? And his visions, like some of Ezekiel's, are far in the future. In fact, most of Daniel's are in the future. He's, far future. Yes, he talked to Nebuchadnezzar about, how he was going to become an animal and those kind of things, but most of when it became visions, at least, it was well in the future, and many of them right to the Messiah, and we see that being carried out. We still have the prophecy to finish, which is the kingdom, final, lasting forever, but we've got it started, right? That forever is started, that everlasting is started because the kingdom started. So, yep, he's talking about his church, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, Justin.
Two things. One, back at the beginning when he was talking about the different beasts, he mentioned the third beast looked like a leopard but had 4 heads. History tells us that when Alexander passed away, he didn't have an heir. His kingdom was divided amongst his four generals, which could be, allusion to that, correlation to that as well. But also, it's the interesting thing about the kingdom, the church coming, being an everlasting kingdom, and being one that would endure forever, both in a spiritual and a physical sense. The Roman Empire, even after they persecuted the church, and towards the end of the Roman Empire timeline, especially after Constantine took the emperorship, he made Christianity the official religion of Rome towards the end. And so not only did Christianity endure through the persecution and establish itself as the church and be forever, but it actually ended up becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. So in a way, it physically took the Roman Empire and defeated it, even through the persecution.
Yeah, in many ways.
It is the Roman Empire now.
So what there is of it.
The Catholic Church.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? And notice the end, again, Daniel's very troubled by what he's hearing because it is shaking up his world, and it's going to mean a lot more tribulation for his people moving forward from that to get to that final part, because he knows if the 4 beasts represent what we think it was representing, there's still 3 more to come from where he's at right now. And there's a pretty awful one, that 4th one coming down the road that he's going to worry about, with horns that are going to go on and that are going to persecute the believers, whether that's, some think it was not the Pope, it's the Syrians, when they came and gave a lot of trouble to the Jews, then that would be the same kind of thing with them. So it's certainly things that troubled him. And so his countenance changed. He's going to be a little bit, as we get bad news or stuff that worries us, you're going to be able to tell it. You can tell it in your family members, your close friends. You know when something's bothering them. And that's what you could tell with Daniel from that. His countenance changed. But he kept the matter in his heart. Who else kept matters in their heart? Do you remember? Mary. Mary's the other one in the Bible that we have keeping things in her heart, right? Hers are a little bit more positive things, But nonetheless, she came things at her heart. In Luke chapter 2, verse 19, we get the situation of his birth and things that went on around that. And at one point, then it says, but Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. And then later on in verse 51, after we have the instance of him as a young boy staying back being in the temple with the teachers there and having conversations and that, saying, this is my Father's business. That, when they go down and they convince him to leave with them, it says in verse 51, then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them, but his mother kept all these things in her heart. So keeping that in there and keeping that in mind, saying this means something, and that's what it was for Daniel. He kept these things in his heart. He didn't ignore it. He didn't say that's not going to happen. In his case, he knew very much that it wasn't going to be stuff that he was going to physically see, because it was much farther into the future from that. Kingdoms didn't come and go quite that quickly necessarily. So he kept those things in his heart, and Mary did the same thing. The only two people we really have that's said about keeping things in their heart, the two of them. So the end of this particular vision, questions, of course, the dream, vision, in this case, vision and dream, apparently. Was that done by Daniel or to Daniel? The situation when it occurred, again, is that they're in captivity, and God deems it important to share with Daniel, a person that he thinks very highly of, as we'll see when we look at the next or last of the visions that he gets. He thinks very, very highly of him. Thus, when it talks about, I wouldn't wipe out a city, even, I'd wipe out the city even if Daniel and some other people show up to it, saying how important or how much he cared about them, how much respect he had for them, how faithful they were to him. He still wouldn't, he'd still wipe it out even if they were there. That's how much he thought of Daniel. But he shared with Daniel something that Daniel would never live to see, but something that Daniel in some way should have been encouraged by what we get to live through and what we have to look forward to from that. The content of that vision in this case was to see these beasts and all that, reflection of what's going to happen in history, the physical world that's going to happen, and then get that enlightenment of a kingdom that goes beyond this world, and that the true followers of God would be a part of from that. And the purpose was to give that information, not only to Daniel, but everybody who would know it afterwards. Thus the importance of him writing the important things down. Is important that, the beast had, 4 paws with, 3 toes on each one of them? Apparently not. He didn't write that down. He took the important things. So the purpose is to share with us the important things to know about history that was foretold and about the ultimate outcome for all of us from that. And I figured into God's plan by giving him the ability to point out and then to look back and say, here it was prophesied by Daniel. You can see it being fulfilled all along the way. And we get to that last part about the Messiah. If the other 4 kings all happen, then this ultimate kingdom, it's just going to happen just the same. If that's foretold, there's no reason to believe the other one's not going to be. So another evidence that God is in control and God knows what's going to happen well before it does happen from that. Any other comments about this vision? So next time we'll pick up in chapter 8. This is one that appeared after the first one that he had, the one you just saw from that. He's going to be in a particular place in the country from there, and he's going to again see beings from that. So it's a very visual one, like we've seen from most of Daniel's along the way, as opposed to ones that are just words. So we'll pick up in chapter 8 and go forward from there next week. Any other comments? Not? Our time's pretty much up. We'll let you go. Thanks. See you next week.